Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is the first roundtable of the new year, the second episode of the new year. I am joined by Keith, Preston, and Logos. I just got a message from Florian that he's using a guest computer, so he'll be a little bit late, presumably because the guest is still using it. So we should expect Florian shortly. So what do I mean by this title, Language, Social Relations, and Economic Inequality? Well, one of the things that I have to keep saying this because people think it's a Marxist talking point. The cash nexus hides social relations. That's a reactionary talking point. That's Thomas Carlyle. And then Marx and Engels both are informed and give proper attribution to Carlyle. So we just got to get this out of the way. This is a reactionary talking point, not a Marxist one. Marxists, you could argue, as George Watson does, are kind of like red Tories. Maybe. But that's not today's discussion. Today's discussion is how language helps reinforce the hiding of social relations to reinforce economic inequality. So in physics, work is defined as a product of force and distance. Let's imagine three men, an operator of a space program, a boomer doing his home improvement project, and a knight who won wealth and fame through ransoming other knights. Each man claims that he did the work, but only one man can really lay any claim to that is the knight. The F value in the first two examples is over 90% produced by chemical processes. In the first, the rocket fuel, and in the second, electrical energy stored in a battery. They are only operators, right? That's like saying George Jetson did the work by pressing a button. Soon the robot can do it better. Think of Tom Cruise in Top Gun. The hotshot pilot is in reality fungible. We now have automated aerial drones that control other drones, with the only human interaction being an operator on the ground giving clearance for the drone to engage a target. What does that mean? It means that the machine is doing the work, not the person. And in fact, with these automated drone fleets that are being built, the only reason why a human is still involved is because they're afraid of some sort of, collateral damage by, the protocol not working, the code not working, and they, either have friendly fire or civilian casualties. So the human is really only there as like a last ditch stopgap. He's not really doing much. The drones take care of themselves. In the modern age, machines do work and people are ancillary to the whole process. The knight, when he wins battles and forces other knights to ransom their lives, can with a far greater effort claim he won wealth by his own hand, as the F value in this example is entirely derived from the knight's own muscles. Why does this matter? It matters in that this social reality, which is hidden by capital, creates a false impression. The work done by machines and employees is counted as work done by the boss, or if tools, by the home improvement guy, which is, of course, absurd. There are not enough hours in the day. So let's break it down, right? So the energy measurement for work is in joules. So there's no possible frickin' way that a single man could have enough joules produced by his own muscles to put a rocket ship into space. No way. No way. The joules produced are produced by other processes of which he is, at best, just the director of. So he's claiming that he did all the work. He produced all the joules, which is absolute nonsense. He didn't produce any of the joules. The joules of energy were produced by these chemical processes, of which he may not even know very much about. He hires experts who know how that works. So that's the first problem. This privileges those with capital who can move bigger piles of sand than Mr. Broke Zoomer. This highlights the first mover advantage in game theory. They pretend the playing field is even when it is rigged. Right? Even if in theory we had an absolute free market. And I know you've gone this place before, Logos. The first one in still has all the capital. He can still take advantage, make moves that the other guy can't. And so even in theory, if there were no government regulations, it would still harm people that came later. Because, you can't really negotiate with a boss if he's got that much of an edge over you with the capital he's accumulated. Now, the other thing is, this hides economic inequalities and forces men born in after generations to suffer an unfair comparison of performance that their elders never really did achieve. We can return to the knight who actually could lay some claim to doing the work, since all of the F value in this expression, all the joules produced were produced by the knight's muscles. We can return to, say, Nebuchadnezzar boasting of his glory in being struck down in Daniel 4, and James's warning against boasting about merchant voyages in James 4:13-17. Now, why is this important? Well, because even if you are a strong king or warrior, there's all sorts of contingencies that could just kill you. Your ships could get lost at sea. Think of like Antonio in The Merchant of Venice, which gets his buddy Bassanio in a lot of trouble when Shylock wants his pound of flesh. What we see is that even in the knight, he is not the author of his own power. He grew up in a privileged aristocratic setting, was given a proper physical education, and properly fed. He did not do these himself. The social context in which he grew up did this. I did this, in scare quotes, falls to dust when you realize that the I speaking is not even the author of its own existence. All of these matters because men who are incompetent and morally compromised defend a system that exerts downward pressure on future generations of men, because that system lets them pretend they are, quote, big men, unquote. All of this is but one fold of the garments that capitalism wears to hide itself. So we'll go with you, Keith. Go ahead. Hey, Florian. You're muted, Keith.
Okay. Well, one thing that I think is interesting about this topic is how it resembles many of the issues you see raised on the left by those that are influenced by the postmodern theorists like Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard and thinkers of that type. Because the core idea there is the idea that language is power, and that language can be used to control discourse, and then discourse forms narratives, and then narratives are used to legitimize a wider meta system that seeks to legitimize the current distribution of power in a particular system. So that's, a lot of people on the left obviously are influenced by this kind of thinking, or at least the modern left, which is why some of them are so big on trying to police language and things of that type. But the actual analytical framework that's associated with this can be applied in many different kinds of contexts. And what we're discussing now is one of those, because if we look at the way in which language and discourse are used to uphold the legitimacy, say, of technocracy, or capitalism in the broad sense, or the plutocratic managerial form of capitalism that we're most familiar with today, and all of the implications of that for class relations and power dynamics and wealth distribution, and then all of the stuff that grows out of that in terms of political power and so forth. We see it's actually very applicable. And in fact, we do see that apologists, for instance, for the current class system, use discourse and language as a means of upholding the class system. For instance, there's that quote from John Steinbeck, going back, a century or so, where he says that the problem in the United States with the working class is that the average working man thinks that he's a temporarily embarrassed millionaire, which in our world today would be a billionaire. And you certainly come across that. It's funny how all the time I come across people of fairly limited financial or socioeconomic resources who basically talk about if you criticize someone like Elon Musk, for example, or some other plutocrat or oligarch, they think, well, that's terrible. That's just promoting class envy, and that's communism. Even though if you look at, as Todd was pointing out, if you go back and you look at the wisdom literature from many, many, many past cultures, whether it's Greco-Roman or Christian or Eastern or something else, you see that there's always this intrinsic warning against concentration of wealth, warning against the pursuit of wealth as an end unto itself. In some pre-modern cultures, certainly certain ancient cultures, the merchant class was viewed the way, say, a respectable middle-class person today might view drug dealers or pimps. There was viewed as something that's kind of unseemly or shady, or maybe it's necessary, but it's not something we really want to promote or glorify. It was sort of base, to be a merchant. Whereas in modern culture, like since the early modern era, as we know, increasingly the modern the merchant class has become the dominant class in modern societies, along with the financiers and what they used to call rentiers and all of that. But we see that language has been reshaped in order to uphold that system of class rule. For instance, take a term like conservative. Right now, in the United States, if you use the term conservative, well, what does that mean? What is somebody who votes for the Republican Party? Or and then if you ask a person like that, well, what do you think about economics? And like, well, the real problem today is that there's too many people living in Section 8 housing, or too many people on welfare, food stamps, or whatever they call it now, EBT cards and that kind of stuff. And that's really what's wrong with the world. It's not that plutocrats are hoarding wealth, or it's not that economic policies are structured in a way that are going to create this kind of wealth imbalance that thinkers, going all the way back to Aristotle or maybe before, have warned against. And instead, the real perpetrators of, say, economic injustice are people who are on public assistance somehow. And interestingly, we've seen, I think, the discourse on that shift a bit in more recent times, because we're now in what some people have called the new Gilded Age in the United States, where we have wealth distribution patterns that now rival what they were during the 1920s, right before the Great Depression. So we're back to where we were 100 years ago. And then what's interesting is that's really come to a head in recent times with this blow up between the MAGA people and Elon Musk and characters like that, where you see the economic nationalists on one hand, and then the oligarchic plutocrats on the other hand, showing that ultimately there is such thing as class conflict. And Bernie Sanders now has come out and said, well, he's actually taking the side of the MAGA folks who were criticizing Elon Musk, saying, well, if this H-1B visa program, all that really is a means to acquire indentured servants from the global South, as opposed to skilled American workers. And of course, an issue there is that these visa workers from places like India, they're not literal indentured servants in a pre-modern sense, but they are partially so, in the sense that they're much more limited in the sense of being bound by employers. If you come to the United States on one of these kinds of visas, you can't necessarily just say, well, I don't like this employer, I'm just going to go find another one, because you don't have a work visa to just work anywhere. So therefore, it's more advantageous for employers to import some of these kinds of visa workers from other places. And of course, so when we get lower in the socioeconomic system, the same is true with the illegal migrants. It's not uncommon among unskilled workers to find illegal migrants working for minimum wage or below minimum wage, and then the employer doesn't pay any payroll taxes on that employee. They're just paying them cash under the table. They're paying them under the minimum wage in some instances. And while that's $5 an hour, say, is nothing in the United States, that goes a long way when you convert it to pesos. So there we have a real instance of class conflict, where you have and then the economic nationalists that you find among a lot of the MAGA base understand this. I mean, because they see it in their own lives. They see it in construction sites and stuff like that in their own lives. Plus, they see it if they work in tech in some of those fields. They see it there as well.
Yeah, Logos, I know you got some stuff to say on this.
Yeah, sorry, a couple of things. The first part of your intro seems to me like a rehash of what we've done earlier, or You Didn't Build That video, where we basically went over the same points, right? When the left, Obama, whatever, finger wags the rich people and says, you didn't build that, at least completely alone or whatever. You had help from machines, people, public roads, heck, even ideas people like Newton admitted they stood on the shoulders of giants. I mean, people underestimating how much of their success they got from other people, probably a pretty well-tread topic. As of late, I think the extra thing to add to the discussion on specifically language is, before it was used defensively by the rich to kind of hide how much help they got from others. Now, people like Vivek are using it offensively to explain why it's justified they move people around, not just machines. We can't find enough good tech workers. U.S. culture sucks. Nobody wants to learn. Nobody wants to do anything, and it's all U.S. people's fault. They're lazy, good for nothings who worship whatever they do. And I think on this dimension that analysis is interesting, because there's a grain of truth to what Vivek is saying, and that's why the tactic is so successful, especially among the faction of the libertarian right that he targets with it. But the problem is nobody does the analysis of why it's successful, right? Why do people worship social media influencers and meme coin manipulators and things like this instead of the types of intellectual skills you'd need to have a good tech job sector? And well, just think about it. What's being more successful in society right now? Hawk to a girl, pumps and dumps a meme currency, and she's going to run off with like $10 million in like a day. How are you going to make that kind of money doing it the fair way, in quotes, the fair way? Go to school, learn a skill, go work for somebody else, to start your own company. I mean, like, it's crazy. And you got the whole meme coin stuff just full of these meme currencies being put on there for pennies, basically, because if some crypto meme currency worth 6 cents is now worth 30 cents, whoever investorly is just quintupled their money, which could happen in months, which is insane. Find me any other investment to quintuple your money in months. So that's kind of where the economy is. Think about the GameStop thing, right? Bunch of hedge funds got it in their heads they're going to short GameStop for whatever reason, because they think they deserve to make money in 3 months or whatever it took for the short to come due. And then you have the other people that are like, well, we can take them for a ride because they're forced to buy the stock at whatever price it is, so let's just pump it. We know what's going on. We're going to pump it and guarantee some money. It's like, this is the economy now. And I've already people in the stock market quite a bit. It's like, well, stock market, it's not risk free. It's like, look at the index fund and tell me it's not risk free. Look at the NASDAQ from 1971. You've basically, I calculated it out. You've been guaranteed almost 8% returns year on year since like 1974. It's a little less if you do it in 1971 because there was a dip at the beginning, but it's like, find me another investment that guarantees you 8%. It's like, it doesn't exist. So this idea, our entire economy is being restructured around the fact that you can make money off money, or you can be a realtor and just move properties around and make money on treating properties like speculative instruments or whatever. So the idea that productive work, intellectual, whatever, it's been kind of eroded away by the success of rich people like Vivek, like Musk, like the meme coin people, like everybody. And people see that and they want to emulate that, because why would they take a bunch of risk, give up half their lives to go to school, all this stuff, when, okay, well, these successful people seem to be doing it, pretty easy, just making money off money. Why can't I do that? And so you're seeing this backlash against school and all the rest of it. So it's like, yeah, there's a kernel of truth to this linguistic attack on kind of like the labor stock of the US. But if our culture has degenerated in this way, it didn't come from nowhere. But of course, they'll never take the responsibility for like their half of that problem. So as far as the language thing goes, I mean, that's the only interesting dynamic I can add over what you and Keith said, I think. The elephant in the room, of course, seems to be Elon Musk. You said you had a comment earlier talking about the H-1B stuff and so on. So it's like, okay, let's dig in, since that seems to be the economic, thing that's going on right now, right? It's not just a problem when a rich person at this point says, I did that, but he's using machines. It's like, well, that's kind of like a domestic issue, right? They're trying to hide how much productivity is them and how much productivity is labor. That boils down to like a domestic labor fight between labor and capital. But in some ways, the problem is more pernicious, because now it's not just your labor and your capital and your companies. You can offshore, you can move stuff around. Our technology has grown to such a point that rich people can just kind of move things around like pieces on a chessboard all over the world, just snap of a finger. Not quite. It takes a little bit to build factories, but they can plan them in advance, and before the workers know it, it's like, oops, there go all your jobs. So that's where I think the thing is more nefarious, is we're not just talking about hiding how much rich people do versus their workers do, which is a pretty good critique about, like, say, how Elon's a genius because, like, he buys a company and names it SpaceX, and all the engineers there invent stuff for him or whatever. But now we're talking about, I'm a genius because I can move people around from another country to here, pay them pennies, and have them do stuff. You're talking about, replacing workforces from whole cloth as kind of like a symbol of rich people's power and their ingenuity and all the rest of it. And that's where I think the dimension has become even more nefarious than it has been historically or in the past. Let's see, is there anything else I want to add? I can't think of anything else. I think listening and thinking, that's the only thing I can say so far.
Okay, Florian, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello. Happy New Year. So, yeah, one thing that is pretty clear to me, or sounds pretty salient to me, is that there's a huge gap, there's a huge divide opening up further and further between the very rich and the workers, right, or the not so rich. So social mobility is increasingly frozen in place, as Keith mentioned, or as some of you guys mentioned. So we may be headed to a new Gilded Age. I had an article recently where someone calculated what it means, this divide already now. And they came to a calculation like, let's say, a rich person has like 11 billion in assets post-tax, and then inflation is like, there's like money printed, and you have like 40% more money printed, for example. Then this means that the value of that guy's assets just went up by 40%. And if you calculate how many years people need to work with income to get there, they would have to work like 30 to like 22 to 30 years right now just to get there, right? And the money supply will increase, inflation will go on, so that divide is impossibly to cross with income alone. There's also, if you're a rich person, you can basically take your income and invest it. This is sort of like tax loophole. You invest it into a company and then like a tax haven like Dubai, and then you pay yourself from ownership capital from that company. And so then you pay literally no tax because you basically borrow against your own company. That is done, and that's a loophole that is very legal. And so if you're a rich person, you have these loopholes you can use, and taxes and everything else doesn't bother you at all. But then there's also different language. People are talking about income inequality when in fact it's wealth, not so much income, because the rich people, they don't get any income. They don't get income that is taxable. They have wealth, and then they use that wealth to generate money for themselves, but they don't have classical income as an employee would have. And so that's one thing where language is not in sync, right? Where people look at the wrong ideas when they want to get ahead, and they don't even speak the language of the top 1%. They don't have any idea what kind of loopholes out there. I only read about this. There's tons more loopholes, and it's basically, if you have a lot of assets and equity, and you talk to other people, out of necessity, right? Because now your circle of friends and colleagues is different from someone who is, just a normal wagey. Then all of a sudden you have a different language, and you have different opportunities that are open for you, and language also plays a role. And like that, normal people, if they don't know about this, they will never be able to even imagine getting to those areas, right? So you can't even, there's people who can't even imagine getting to fabulous rich that the top 1% have. And then you will not have a language to find an expression for that, right? But it also reflects in a different mindset. There was this one tweet by Vivek Ramaswamy where he basically said, and Logos alluded to that, and where basically Vivek said, now all the Native Americans, they care about the prom queen, and all these like monster trucks and all these things. They should care about preparing for the math Olympiad. But this is a very arrogant mindset that this tweet betrays, and it's basically, no, you're not good enough with your Americana culture. That's just nothing. You need to be IQ maxing, right? You need to go to all these competitions, and you need to form yourself in a competitive person. And Sam Hyde had like a 45-minute video about that on X. I recommend that on the 31st of December. He said, if we want to just emulate China, that's not a worthwhile society. That's just emulating slave labor, right? If you have to grind and grind and grind and do competitions and this, and you don't engage in your own culture, then you lose it, right? And that's also a language. That's also a language barrier where you could actually see that someone like Vivek doesn't even have an idea how to connect to normal people, right? So there's already, we see there's a language barrier between different classes in society, if you wish, and it's very difficult to close up to other classes if you don't speak their language at all, right? And to just give you an impression how bad how bad Musk's and Vivek's behavior and other people of the tech bro ride was in this recent H1B snafu. Yeah, Vivek and Elon got outflanked by Bernie on the left saying don't get all the visa, and from the right, Nikki Haley of all. Nikki Haley said, I understand the American worker, right? And that's actually dangerous for the incoming administration because that's an easy wedge issue where the left can score points. Just imagine Gavin Newsom. He just plans out a strategy now how he can attack the Trump administration in 2028 and win against JD Vance, right? So there really is a distance in language, and I think what George Orwell once said about the use of language that holds true here also, right? It's not just like in 1984 you use Newspeak, you need all these language codes to basically make it impossible to attack the system. But yeah, you can also see this reflected in language-wise. You're impossible to get on the same footing with the top 1%, and that's a real problem for society because then that gap cannot ever be mended. The gap between the very poor and the very rich.
Yeah. So there's a couple of points here. The importance, because again, we want to focus here on language, and as you said, Logos, we've already previously done a video on, you didn't build this. I've done videos on my own, but I have to reiterate the point because we're talking about language and what exactly is the language hiding. So when somebody says, I did this project, they do not literally mean this. I produced all the joules of work. But think about a politician who says, I'm in favor of freedom. Now, all the multitudinous ways that the audience hears that is what he's counting on, even though he didn't literally say anything that anybody in the audience heard. That's just a politics game. So people who are low resolution thinkers are going to think, oh, wow, Mr. X produced all the joules of this company. He's amazing. He's a demigod. No, he didn't. That's literally absurd. Nobody has that power. But that's how they think. And that's why they use such mealy-mouthed language. They're politicians. They want you to think they did it all, but they don't really say it, but they act like it. Now, to reiterate this again, let's go back to Thomas Carlyle, The Sign of the Times. He says, this is 1829, so it's 200 years ago, more or less. Nothing is now done directly or by hand. All is by rule and calculated contrivance. For the simplest operation, some helps and accompaniments, some cunning abbreviating process is in readiness. Older modes of exertion are all discredited and thrown aside. Okay, and then we can skip down a little bit. He also says, everything has its cunningly devised implements. It is pre-established apparatus. It is not done by hand, but by machinery. Thus, we have machines for education, Lancastrian machines, Hamiltonian machines, monitors, maps, emblems, instruction. That mysterious communing of wisdom with ignorance is no longer an indefinable tentative process requiring a study of individual aptitudes and a perpetual variation of means and methods to attain the same end, but a secure, universal, straightforward business to be conducted in the gross by proper mechanism with such intellect as comes to hand. Okay, so this is the actual reality that Carlyle is pointing to. Now, why does this matter? Because if you create, and Logos, we've talked about this before, the problem of mediating through technology, right? If you are if, for example, if you want to be heard today, you're going to have to, do social media. You're going to have to, you can't go to the Agora and talk to people like you could in the past. You can't be like Descartes, just walk into a university, interrupt a lecture, and, tell the professor he doesn't know what he's talking about and then walk out. You can't do that anymore. But wait, what were they using? Their hands, their feet to walk around, hands to open doors and do work, and then their mouth to speak. Everybody has that. That's an equalizing. If the majority of work and communication is done using organic human capacities, it is an equalizer in the sense that everybody has them. But once you force people to mediate through technology, you create a capital cap where the people that don't have the capital just can't participate because you've raised the barrier to entry, and that barrier keeps rising. And some of these things you could argue were necessary, i.e., improve production for armaments so you don't get conquered. Okay. But there's no reason why we have to have smartphones. I mean, people communicated far more effectively back in the 60s before all this, and far better, far more easily in the ancient agora of Athens and Rome. So there was no plaza other than profit. You could just sell people phones that they'd throw away in a couple of years. So what you do then is you leave more and more people behind because and if you have first mover advantage, which a lot of these elite bourgeoisies do in the United States, you just can't touch that. And let's recontextualize all of this into something even simpler than economics. Let's just use game theory. It's just a game. If a game is being played where somebody has first mover advantage and they cheat all the time, it's a chump move to play the game. Play a different game. Good example would be the American Revolution. The British had mastered the art of line and column warfare, and the Americans resorted to bushwhacking and never giving up. And the British were infuriated and couldn't win. Right? It's the American way to fight your enemy on the terms that he doesn't have the advantage on, except apparently now in the economic context. Logos. Hey there, Logos? You're muted.
I'm sorry, I missed that. What was that?
No, you were muted. We couldn't hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, it's my turn. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think what I said before pretty much stuck to the problems of language. I mean, this is. I mean, it's basically, again, it's like you didn't build that from a different perspective, right? Instead of rich people saying like I built that or whatever, it's I did that basically. This is Todd's I did that stream. You didn't do that. The machines did it. I don't know what more really I could add.
Well, do you have anything to say, Logos, about the shifting scale? Once we move away from hands and feet and mouths, and we have to use machines and telecommunications.
Oh yeah. I said that in my intro for sure. And I mean, the shifting scale is even worse because it's not just mechanical barrier to entry, which in some ways rises, in some ways lowers. Like sometimes technology makes it even easier to get some of the components to get into a thing. Like remember, like it used to be that computers took up whole rooms. A PC that we'd have on our desk today. Like I have a handheld as my PC at the moment. And, it used to take up like whole rooms or whole buildings, way back in the day. No average person could have even afforded a computer. So, I mean, that's kind of like gray as far as like barriers to entry rising and lowering. Like AI is tough because like you have really big corporations making and controlling AI, but they lease it to use for anybody. And AI can do some powerful stuff. It can code for you increasingly, it can do all sorts of stuff. So, sure, you have to kind of pay the pauper as far as the source of the AI, but it can do very powerful stuff for you on the back end, which you'd ordinarily have to hire like a team and a firm to do like previously. So that's kind of like gray. But I think the real danger for technology is how efficient travel and communication has become to the point where you can replace people with other people. Like that seems to be getting worse and worse and worse decade after decade with no kind of trade-offs in sight in the way that like machines have gotten.
Right, that's true. Just one thing I'll add before I hand this off to Florian is, in this regard, AI tools like Grok and ChatGPT might actually be helpful because older generations would intentionally lie to younger generations about what we might call trade secrets. The information that gave them their professional edge. Grok or ChatGPT isn't going to lie to you and say, "Well, I don't know." No, it's just going to tell you, "Here's the answer." Boom, there it is. So I think there's a chance that this could actually be an equalizer if handled correctly. Florian.
Yeah, in direct connection to that, I recently read a tweet where somebody remarked that probably a lot of white people in their 50s and 60s that were working at corporations have used DEI to basically get rid of their up and coming 20 to 30-year-old competitors, right? So you basically, that's a version of holding back your own, holding, building your own social group and not letting anyone in, and using modern tool of language that you may also see that DEI is kind of its own language. And in that respect, I find like many different classes and different professional groups have developed their own language, and that's a way of siloing groups in society away from one another, right? It's very difficult, though, to really go back to a language that is pure, where you would really say something that is, where you would really use your mouth unadulterated by any terminology or any niche specific knowledge to just tell people how it really is, right? I mean, I think one example of somebody who really reaches people that other people have never understood, like, is Trump, right? Everyone said, "Oh, Trump, he talks like a third grader. He thinks his audience, they're all babies. He's like, oh, he talks so stupid, ha ha ha." But that way, we reached a shit ton of people that really weren't even reached by the current elites of society. And so, in a way, technology has made it tougher for people to catch up, but it has also allowed, like, especially also if you look at Grok and ChatGPT, there are always options for people that aren't in the upper echelons to make themselves heard. So maybe the cell phone is even, or maybe the smartphone is even a very good tool to democratize speech. Because if I think about the Greek agora or Roman philosophers, you probably wouldn't, if you were like a normal, like a low class person, you wouldn't even have dared to go up and speak to them. And even now, you cannot really speak to some scholars because you wouldn't even speak their language. Language is used as some kind of like a barrier to exclude people, right? But thanks to the cell phone and like on Twitter, everyone is basically anonymous if he chooses to be, and so you can actually break through that language barrier. There's no way to exclude you in any way, shape, or form, and you can use a language that reaches many people, and that actually circumvents the gatekeepers. So that's something that strikes me more or less right now. So in that way, maybe social media and modern technology is actually a good thing in terms of the use of language, right? Because you can really say things that you really mean and make yourself understood to many other people, and there's no way for gatekeepers to shield themselves off from social mobility.
Yeah. Okay. Keith, ball's in your court.
Well, of course, one of the key insights that Karl Marx came up with was the way in which material forces shape social evolution and historical developments, and how the interaction of technology and economic systems has a transformative effect on individual societies. Now, you can argue that Marxism, I think you can correctly argue that Marxism is perhaps overly reductionist when it comes to these questions, but it's still a pretty interesting and I think important insight. And getting back to the Gilded Age analogy I was using before, right now really is very similar to the 19th and early 20th century, when during the Industrial Revolution you had changes taking place in societies that were unprecedented and extremely far-reaching. And something similar is happening now with digital technology. Digital technology is to the 21st century what industrial technology was to the 19th century. And it's not just purely in the realm of material conditions. It's also in the realm communication, as we've been talking about, and culture, and the way in which those intersect. For instance, if we go back and look at history, we see that the Protestant Reformation of the early 16th century is really the beginning in many ways of modernity. We see that the late Renaissance, late medieval era overlaps with the rise of the Reformation, and then out of that we start to see the emergence of the scientific revolution and the market revolution and all of that. But one of the things that made the Protestant Reformation possible was technology, and that was the invention of the printing press. Prior to the invention of the printing press, first of all, most people were illiterate, as far as religious matters. The old biblical manuscripts were all in Latin and Koine Greek and things like that. They hadn't even been translated into common languages, and not that it would have mattered anyway, because most people couldn't read and write in any language. But then you start to see, not only with the Reformation, do you start to see these religious texts being translated into vernacular language, but they're also become more widely dispersible through the use of the printing press, along with other, Reformation documents, and then later other kinds of documents. And then that leads towards the development of societies with higher levels of literacy. Like Protestants tended to place a greater emphasis on literacy than Catholicism. And one of the reasons why was that they wanted you to be able to read sacred religious texts like the Bible. In fact, Scotland was one of the first European countries to achieve a majority literacy rate, largely for this reason. And nowadays, in more recent times, with the advent of communications technology like social media and all the other stuff we have today, the internet, that's having a similar effect in a cultural setting, because it's allowing forms of communication to take place and discourse to take place in a way that is shaping culture in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few decades ago. For instance, all of these political currents that we've seen emerge in more recent times, like, say, Occupy Wall Street, or MAGA, or Black Lives Matter, or whatever you think of those, or whatever whatever they were. All of these things were made possible in large part through internet coordination, through internet communication. And that was one thing that a lot of people pointed to when the Arab Spring happened back in 2011, is that this was largely made possible through social media. In fact, that's why some of the governments in some of those countries were trying to block some of the social media sites where that was going on. So social media is becoming like the printing press of modernity, or post-modernity. And with that, we see the shaping of not only communications, but we also see the shaping of industry and commerce, where now digital capitalism is replacing industrial capitalism. For instance, e-commerce is starting to replace traditional commerce. Instead of going to what they call a brick and mortar store in the retail world, now you just buy everything on Amazon. I know people that never go to a department store or things like that anymore. They just order it all through online systems, and that is shaping the way that people make their living. For instance, in the Industrial Revolution, for example, that one of the impacts of that was that artisans and craftspeople and some of these pre-existing models of production were eliminated by industrialization. For instance, in today's world, we no longer have cobblers. We no longer have glass blowers, and all these old skills that were actually fairly developed skills. You can still go to historic sites and find people that know how to do some of this kind of stuff. But all of these skills were lost along the way, and of course, people who had those skills lost their livelihoods. And we're starting to see that as well. We're starting to see that with outsourcing, with automation, more and more people are losing their livelihoods to technology. It's been discussed, for example, that once self-driving cars and self-driving trucks become a thing, how many truck drivers, which in the United States is millions of people, how many truck drivers are going to be out of work? Well, a whole lot. Or if self-driving cars, like Musk and other people are trying to develop, when those become a thing, how many taxi drivers are going to be out of work, or how many Uber and Lyft drivers are going to be out of work? So we're starting to see this repetitive process taking place where technology is displacing large numbers of people, and those who can't make the adjustments are not able to keep up, and that's why they're falling into things like what are called the precariat, or those that are, or the gig economy, and all of these kinds of things. Where nowadays you have people who work multiple part-time jobs, and multiple part-time minimum wage jobs, and then they live in their car. That's the kind of thing that happened during the Industrial Revolution. And the process is repeating itself. So we're going to start to see some serious upheaval, I think, in the future because of these kinds of conditions that are developing.
All right. So I think what would be a nice place to start wrapping up is we've talked about how language hides all of this. I think maybe, and this is actually partly, I'll blame you for this, Logos. We need to describe, or at least just as a final thought or final statement, give us a sort of like touch point for how we might use language correctly to not only expose what's being hidden by language, but to describe possibly something to replace it. So what I've been thinking about, listening to all of you guys here and ruminating my own thoughts, is what we need to look for is an integration. So if we look at how language developed, we have the wisdom literature from all the different traditions that you mentioned, Keith, and then language really shifts with the rise of the bourgeoisie. Everything is just reduced to monetary exchange, the cash nexus. So a whole bunch of complex ideas no longer get accounted for, because the cash nexus can't account for them, so therefore they go underproduced and they disappear. And then the industrial civilization kicks off, and then there's another whole language game that develops, which culminates in the computer language, which again reduces things to a kind of crude reductionism. So we lose a lot of complexity in the way we can talk about things. So what I'm envisioning is an integration of the key insights of the wisdom literature, with the key insights of how modernity works on a nuts and bolts level from the old left, the anti-capitalist left, and then unite them into a new language system whereby we keep all of the best insights of the past, as well as acknowledging that new things were invented, around 200 years ago with industrial civilization, and things have changed, but again, not in the fundamental way that we think. So as a good analogy here, at the end of the First World War, there were two schools of thought as to how technology affected war. The one we saw in England and France was that technology had fundamentally altered war, so we could just dispense with all the old rules. And the Germans were like, no, the old rules still hold. We need to integrate that with the new technology. And of course, that led to the fall of France in 6 weeks. It's a crude analogy, but that's sort of what it would look like once you put this into place. So that's my final thought. Logos.
I mean, some of the language changes that would more accurately reflect what's going on, I don't know that they'd move the needle that much. So, for example, rich people doing stuff with people and machines, instead of saying, I did that, I created that, they could just say, I orchestrated that, right? I'm thinking about an orchestra as an analogy. The orchestral head who composes the music doesn't play all the instruments. He's not all the people in the chairs playing those instruments. He didn't build the instruments, but he's certainly controlling the outcome, basically, with this little stick waving it around and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it seems like perfectly accurate to me to say that something like, Elon Musk isn't the genius, doing stuff with, I don't know, SpaceX or Tesla, but it seems pretty accurate to me to say Elon Musk orchestrates the outcomes of, Tesla and SpaceX. And I think that captures a lot of what's going on enough that kind of like the sycophants we're all worried about, probably aren't going to move the needle on, their view of him too much, because, in the end, orchestral leaders are still, very respected people because they're ability to direct things. So, I mean, with respect to that, that's I think how the meta would change things if this became a really big problem. It's like they orchestrate this. The place where I think we can change language to very clearly describe what's going on is already kind of being done on the right and on the left. There are two uses of H1Bs, for example. There are uses where they just legitimately can't find people Now, there are reasons why they can't find people that I think, Eric Weinstein talked about pretty well. It's like, in the 80s and 90s, people got really advanced PhDs, and then foreigners got them too and got the jobs cheaper. So these people like really invested like 15 years of their lives, and they just got like undercut at the very end of the finish line. So there are reasons for it, but there are instances where, for good reasons, Americans aren't getting these really advanced niche degrees in these disciplines. You have to bring people in to get these jobs done. Fine. So people are trying to split the thing on H-1Bs, where you have actual necessarily skilled H-1Bs, and you have kind of like chattel H-1Bs, I guess some people call them, where they're not doing stuff that's necessary in demand skill-wise. They are just trying to underpay workers. They're coming up with acronyms. They have an acronym that's like a combination of different like consultancy companies, where the consultancy companies will sponsor the H-1Bs to then do works for these various corporations. It's been too long. It's been a couple of days since I saw the conversations on this. But so where this is irrelevant and effective, people seem to already be developing the linguistic tools to split the kind of hairs that we're worried about. I think the last cultural front is what I'm worried about. So the nuts and bolts economics are being done, but this recent attack on culture, Americans, being more stupid and prom kings and blah, 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 blah. I think that's going to be the last frontier where we have to split hairs on language to explain what is kind of like our Americans kind of like grassroots native proclivities to things that just don't make sense, like, I don't know, football or, the prom king. And where are people thinking they can get successful by writing on non-productive labor, right? So where people aren't valuing education because they think they're going to become some social media influencer or something like that, I think is a complete distinct non-grassroots kind of cultural artifact that needs to be talked about in lieu of the other one, so we can separate the grain of truth from Ramaswamy's kind of remarks from the kind of new modern stuff that's coming from artifacts of the excesses of meme currency and stock nonsense. So that's what interests me at the end of the topic.
All right. So Florian, but the same question for you. How would you envision beginning to think about language differently to describe things correctly, rather than just complaining about how it is used now?
Yeah, very interesting. I'm once again reminded of Sam Hyde when Logos spoke about like the language, the common language, what maybe the common language that people use. Memes. I think Sam Hyde said that he gets all his information, all his political information from memes. And in a way, that's interesting because it's going back to showing like I think that's what happened when they started to translate the Bible into vernacular, that there was often maybe many pictures that would depict what happened in each of the chapters in the Bible, each of the books, and kind of like those were probably medieval versions of memes, and that's very interesting. I think we
So real
will
quick, Florian. Yeah, Luther was a meme master.
yeah yeah, and then also what you said with the Industrial Revolution, or that over time, when all the skills and craftsmanship vanished, that then people used language that was more geared towards monetary exchange, right? Not so much to skills. Well, we are in a situation where, as Keith said, we are comparable to the Industrial Revolution, with the online social media revolution. But I would even go a step further, because now you get more and more people that completely leave the grid. They go off grid, and you have now the ability to fend for yourself with the technology at hand. And so you will get more of like smaller groups, microstates, sovereign individuals. Balaji Srinivasan's The Network State speaks about that. I'm reading a book called The Sovereign Individual right now, and they talk about people becoming more local and more anonymous, sort of like imagine like you have people that if you are on the high sea, away from any land mass, right, nobody can control you there effectively. And you can look at the online at the new online paradigm as kind of the high seas, right? You can drop off, you can be completely anonymous and form your own commune with like-minded people. And so I imagine that will also start to develop their own languages, right? You can easily imagine some of these microstates or groups that are kind of anonymous, they develop their own language and vocabulary to distinguish themselves from the rest and to bond together more. But then again, that would mean you have a future where everyone speaks like where there are thousands different languages, and I'm not sure that will work as a total. So I could imagine we'll have some common language that's dictated by the use of technology, and then we may have some local dialects that are spoken in that specific microstate, and then other microstates or other sovereign groups have other dialects. But the overall language will probably go a little bit away from the exchange of goods and values, and go more towards maybe meme infused online technology vernacular. I can imagine that, but it's really very interesting to look at the options, and really to think about how language has changed and will probably also change with the new technology. What that should be and what it might be, I'm not sure, but I'm just noting that these are things that can become, that these are how things can develop. And yeah.
All right. So yeah, Keith, you get the last word. Same question.
Well, I think in the future there's going to be an upswing in class-based politics, and we're already seeing that. We're seeing it on the right with the split between the tech oligarchs and the economic nationalists, and we're also seeing a lot of people on the left saying, "Well, okay, why did we win? Why did we lose this last election?" And there's a big debate on the left now about whether they should move towards emphasizing economic populism, or whether they should double down on wokeism, or whether they should try to become more like Bill Clinton and be liberal Republicans or something like that. But I do think that out of all this kind of discourse, class-based politics is going to make a reappearance, and it's going to be because material forces are driving that. One thing that's interesting about what Ramaswamy said recently, excuse me, I have to take this, but
All right.
I'll just wrap it up quickly by saying, yeah, I think that Ramaswamy's arguments are kind of beside the point, because not everybody can be a tech worker. I mean, what he said is just a glorified version of learn to code. So.
All right. See you, Keith. Bye-bye. All right. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.